Hi everyone, I'm Mr. Glazer, and today we're going to be talking about one of our most famous progressive presidents, a man named Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt for short, excuse me. So he is a progressive president, and don't forget, this is the progressive era we're talking about. And whenever we talk about a progressive president or someone who's progressive, that person wants to make progress for society. They want to reform something. They want to fix problems from the Gilded Age, the previous time, or fix problems that exist in society. So a few problems he wants to fix, or a few reforms, few places he wants to make progress on, is something called conservation. So he is what we call a conservationist president. So if we see the word conservationist right here, or conservation, the root of that word is conserve. If we conserve something, we're trying to protect it. We're trying to make sure it doesn't run out. So what he's trying to conserve is the environment, the resources, the animals, the wildlife, the plant life. He notices that big businesses are going out and destroying big, beautiful places and extracting resources and urbanizing and creating cities all over these beautiful places in the country. And he wants to protect that. He wants to protect those animals, those beautiful areas, those natural resources, so on, so on. But he is also what we call a trust buster. Now, if you remember, another word for trust is just a monopoly. So President Theodore Roosevelt hates monopolies and trusts. So remember, a monopoly is when one business, one company, owns all of the competition. They own everything that's happening in that industry. They're the only ones that sell a particular good or service. So they have a monopoly on a good. Remember, Rockefeller had a monopoly on oil. He's the only one that sells it, and that creates a lot of negatives. And we'll get into that more in a second. So what President Theodore Roosevelt wants to do is he actually wants to break up those big businesses that have monopolies, that have trusts, because that lack of competition causes prices to go up. Let's look more into that right now. So he wants a few big business reforms. We'll get into that in just a second. Let's look at this picture. It says 4 reasons why monopolies are bad for an economy. They can set any price that they choose. Remember, if one company goes out and gets rid of all the competition, no one is competing for their business. They're the only ones that sell it. And if they're the only ones that sell it, and if people want it, they'll pay higher prices for it. So usually monopolies will increase the prices of goods, which hurts consumers, hurts people. They can supply inferior products. We'll look at that one together with the other one. So they supply inferior products and they lose any incentive to innovate. So if we have a big business, we have a monopoly that sells phones, for instance. Let's imagine if Apple was the only company that sold phones. They have a monopoly on cell phones. Would Apple care about improving their phone? Probably not. They don't have to innovate in their phone anymore because they're the only ones that create it. If you want a phone, you have to get it through Apple. And there's no reason to try to create all these new features and innovate because there's no one else selling phones. No, your customers, I don't know why I forgot that word. Your customers have nowhere else to go to get a product that they want. So in a sense, Apple could also just decide, if they had a monopoly, let's make phones worse quality because no one else is selling phones. We don't have to spend as much money creating our good, and we could keep prices the same. So we also can supply inferior products. This is what happens when we have a monopoly. The businesses stop working for your business because they know you're already going to buy it. So monopolies cause prices to go up by getting rid of competition. They eventually stop caring about their products so much, so they could actually make the quality of those products worse. They have inferior products. They lose any incentive to innovate, which means, again, they don't have to fight to compete with another company, so they're not going to have all these new features or make their product better in any way. And they also create inflation, which is not good for an economy. So what President Roosevelt wants to do, President Theodore Roosevelt, is he's going to sign something called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, if we see the word antitrust in there, another word for trust is just monopoly. So we know that this act, this law, is anti-monopoly. It's going to do something to monopoly. So what it does is it's going to make these monopolies and trusts illegal. You can't have one. And it's also going to separate and break up an existing monopoly, an existing big business that sells that one product, into separate companies, multiple separate companies. So now we're going to have more competition. So instead of just having that one company's broken up into, say, like 5 companies, and all these 5 companies now have to fight against each other to sell the same product. So they are now going to innovate, they're going to make their products better, they're going to lower their prices so it's better for consumers. So this is how Theodore Roosevelt wanted to help consumers out with these big business reforms. Remember, antitrust just means anti-monopoly. Let's look at how this actually worked. So right here we see that oil company we've been talking about, Standard Oil, which was founded by Rockefeller. He was the only one that was selling oil in the late 1800s. So the Sherman Antitrust Act happened, and then it's going to break up this company into 7 different oil companies, and they're all going to start competing with each other. Oh, excuse me, it's way more. We're only looking at 7. It's going to break it into 34 different companies. So now instead of one company selling you oil and having a high price, we're going to break up that one company into 34 different companies, and they're going to all compete with each other. Oh yeah, as it says right here. All right, and as you see, you recognize some of these companies that we have today as they have evolved over the last century or so. You see things like Exxon, Chevron, Texaco, Mobil, that have all been, that were all originally part of Rockefeller's monopoly, which sold oil at high prices. So this is how the Sherman Antitrust Act actually worked. Broke up that one big company into separate companies to create more competition, which means they all compete with each other, which means prices go down. There's one other big business reform that we want to talk about. It's something called the Interstate Commerce Act. So if we look at the word interstate, inter just means between, and and then we have state. We know what a state is. Texas is a state, California, so on and so on. So if it says interstate, it just means between states. So this is an act that talks about commerce, or buying or selling things. That's what commerce means. Buying or selling things between states. Specifically, though, what's going to ship things throughout states? The railroad industry. So as we remember, railroads were hurting farmers back during the Gilded Age and the early Progressive era. They were charging farmers way too high rates. There wasn't any standard rate. If farmers wanted to ship their crops over to be sold, they had to go through the railroad, and they had to pay enormous fees for doing it. So the Interstate Commerce Act is actually going to say this is very unfair, and now they're going to regulate or put rules on the railroad industry to stop this behavior. So it's going to eliminate these unfair business practices. So if you want to ship something, they have to make it fair. They have to do it. They have to have a standard rate. If you're shipping this much weight, it's going to cost this much. Or this much product, it's going to cost this much. So it just makes things more fair. Kind of like the Sherman Antitrust Act made things more fair for consumers. Let's look at a few political cartoons. So here we have, guess which president? President Theodore Roosevelt. And he says, no mollycoddling here. And if we look so he's holding this big bat, this big stick, and you see on the ground, what do we see? We all see these rich guys, and they say, trust, railroad trust, oil trust, beer trust, so on, everything in general. What's he doing to those trusts? He's knocking them down. Another word for trust, again, was monopoly. So he is knocking down all the monopolies. He's saying no more monopolies, no more trusts. So think about which act that was. Over here, we also have Theodore Roosevelt. He's holding another bat that says obey the laws. And right here it says we have a man who represents the railroad industry. And he's saying, Mr. President, please go easy. Well, we see that he also, it says President Roosevelt here if you didn't notice, So he's also trying to stop the railroad industry with the Interstate Commerce Act. So as we were saying, this was our Sherman Antitrust Act. He went after all of the trusts and monopolies, broke them up with the Sherman Antitrust Act, and over here, like I had just told you, he tried to stop the railroad industry using the Interstate Commerce Act, which put rules on the railroads and stopped those unfair practices. So for these reasons, we call President Roosevelt the trust buster. He busts up trusts. He stops them. He breaks them. He does not like them. He wants to make big business reforms. So what do they both have in common? They are stopping unfair business practices that occurred during the Gilded Age. No more railroads abusing farmers. No more monopolies and trusts hurting consumers, stopping innovation, causing prices to go up by getting rid of competition. We're getting rid of those things. And the last thing, we also said he is a trust buster, but he is also a conservationist. Remember, conservation, we are just protecting resources, conserving resources. So like I had said before, he just wants to protect the environment from big businesses. So this is a man who really doesn't like these big businesses screwing with the environment or screwing with consumers or workers. So protect our environment, our animals from cities growing through urbanization, big business activity, from getting resources, pollution from factories. So he is going to set up a few things to help protect the wildlife, the forests, natural resources, animals, and a few things he's going to create is the Federal Bird Reserve to help protect the birds, obviously, and something called the U.S. Forest Service, which is going to help protect millions of acres of land and protect forests around the United States, stop them from being cut down. And many of these are eventually going to become national parks, which Theodore Roosevelt is famous for. And here is Theodore Roosevelt at one of our most famous national parks, which is Yosemite, as you see right here. Here he was around the time it was becoming a national park. Big environmentalist right here, and it is a beautiful place. So here's a few things that he is doing with conservation. He's going to say 230 million acres of land are going to be protected from big businesses. Lots of those areas are going to have beautiful areas like we see in this photo here, which are going to become national parks in the future. He's going to designate 150 national forests that have to be protected. No one can go cut them down, hunt the animals, so on and so on. He's going to create 4 national game preserves. That's where people are allowed to hunt, and it's regulated to protect the animals, make sure they don't all go extinct or endangered and such, and create 18 national monuments around the country that should be protected. All right, so that is President Theodore Roosevelt, the trust-busting conservationist president from the Progressive era. Have a great day, guys. I'm Mr. Glazer.